It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jakkie Cilliers to visit the IPCS for this seminar. And we have an ongoing relationship with the Institute of Strategic Security Studies in South Africa. And the IPCS is also a member of a consortium that we set up some 9 years ago, which we termed as the GIBSA, Germany, India, Brazil, South Africa Dialogue. The leading think tank from each of these 4 countries meet together to discuss the strategic environment in their respective spheres or their respective continents, and also take up a global issue. And these meetings have been going on, as I said, for about 9 years, and have facilitated and allowed us a little bit to exchange some of the views, differing developments that take place, and also exchange ideas. In that context, it's a great pleasure to invite Dr. Jakkie Cilliers. He's one of the outstanding strategy experts from Africa. His sphere of expertise as well as studies extend all of Africa, and so therefore he's the top expert in all of Africa on all aspects of security and such. And of course, having interacted with him for the last 9 years or more, perhaps, I can vouchsafe for that as well. Dr. Cilliers has carried out a detailed study of this particular aspect, having toured all over the world, done a lot of studies, and he has some very interesting ideas to share. Though UN Security Council reforms is by no means anywhere near the top of the agenda in any strategic dialogue right now, but let's not forget that it was a few years ago. And even though we may even be convinced that nothing much is going to happen, at least during my lifetime, but nevertheless, it's an area that we need to continue to keep engaged on. And in that context, as I said earlier, Dr. Cilliers has got some very interesting proposals to make. So with those brief comments, may I invite Dr. Cilliers to make his comments.
General, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in Delhi. I haven't been here for many years. I'm going to first let me talk a little bit about violence and instability in Africa. This is over the last 5 years, a map of where political violence happened in Africa. It's data from ACLED, University of Sussex, and it just is a cumulative map of where instability happens in Africa. Although we often don't realize that, since people are responsible for violence, the more people there are, the more violence there is. This may sound stupid, but it is so true. So if there are more people, instability should increase. And that is what we see. But we also see, this is from 1960 to 2014, that in actual fact, in the run-up to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was in actual fact a larger increase in instability globally, in this case in actual fact in armed conflict. Then we see the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the peace dividend in the years after that, and then we see what we are experiencing at the moment, fluctuating and potentially increases in instability. This is globally. So clearly, the tensions around the run-up to the end of the Cold War increased global stability. And then, as I've said, this pent-up demand was released with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. We saw the peace dividend, and now we see, well, what is going to happen? Are we seeing, as we think we are experiencing, an increase in global instability? What is driving this? Of course, my talk is not globally, but really in Africa. Now, things have changed in my part of the world, as you will all know. You all know about the rising Africa, positive, good news about Africa, and it is true. Until the mid-1980s, things in Africa were not going well. That trend has changed very dramatically. This changes everything. Without growth, nothing is possible. Without growth, we can have redistribution, but it is unstable. It creates instability. That picture means probably that Africa's future is not only a more prosperous future, but also probably a more stable and secure Africa, as I will try and explain. I think what we all know, and that is that violence and instability is largely an internal issue. We don't see armed conflict between countries. Armed conflict is largely an internal. Now, Africa and the Middle East are the two regions that are the most unstable globally. But these regions face a particular characteristic. A non-state conflict is a conflict between two non-state actors. So in other words, there isn't a government involved. And this story tells you a significant amount about why there is instability in Africa and the Middle East. Africa has got a particular high burden of so-called non-state conflict, non-state armed conflict. That is rebel groups fighting one another, splitting and fighting one another, but not really the government. Why would that be the case? It is because African governments generally don't control their territory, because of limited governance in Africa. That's the most important explanatory factor for the high levels of armed conflict in Africa, is simply limited government capacity to control territory. Now, we see that is characteristic of Africa. It's also a large increase in the Middle East, which we know about, ISIS and everything else. And then we see that increase in the Americas. That was the drug wars in Mexico. The drug wars in Mexico were so violent that in actual fact, they eventually were categorized as a war. So I've said that Africa and the Middle East are relatively unstable by global standards, that the Middle East and Africa particularly share a particular characteristic of high levels of non-state armed conflict, where rebels fighting one another. In recent years, we have seen an increase in instability in Africa. We see from about 2010 onwards, have seen an increase in instability in Africa. But not only in Africa. It is largely a global trend. What are the reasons for this? Well, let me maybe first just summarize what I've said thus far. I've said until 1989, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we had instability that increased at a faster rate than the population. You remember that graph. Then I said we had quite a sharp decrease in instability from 1989 to 2005, and then from about 2010, we've seen an increase in instability globally, but particularly in Africa. There are three types of violence or instability or political violence that drives that increase. The first is resource competition, particularly in rural areas. The second is violence around democracy, elections, and so on. And of course, the third is the rise in terrorism. So these are the main types of instability that we've seen that has caused an increase in instability in Africa since 2010. We don't know where this is going to go, but it is important in understanding that violence to say that it is, as that map demonstrated, it's not equally spread out on the continent. Nigeria has got a population of, depending on your figures, 186 million, compared to the, 10 or 12 million of, let's say, South Sudan or of Somalia. So if we say Nigeria is very unstable because there are many people, therefore there is lots of violence, in actual fact, when you ask what is the fatalities per 100,000 people, Nigeria doesn't really feature that much. So as much as we read about the terrible violence in that Boko Haram is responsible for and instability in Nigeria, it's important to put that into context. It's a simple point, but it's hugely important because it changes your understanding of instability and violence entirely. The countries that are the most unstable, where the conflict burden is the highest, is Somalia, South Sudan, and Libya. Few characteristics of conflict and instability in Africa. It's typically fought on the periphery of states. Insurgents are normally military weak and factionalized. There are a number of actors and non-state conflict actors, and their involvement is rising. Many of these insurgent groups have strong transnational characteristics, and they move relatively easily across borders and between states. There is convergence and connection between networks of organized crime and their illicit activities, including money laundering, kidnapping, drug trafficking, and everything else that's bad. To an extent, in the era of democracy and elections, we have seen violent competition move from armed opposition in marginal rural areas to violence around the election process itself. This is actually a good news story, because it tells you the extent to which political contestation in Africa is a contestation about governance and how democracy is becoming the game in town. Localized violence over access to livelihood resources such as land and water is increasing, and this includes farmer-herder conflict. And Africa has particularly high levels of so-called non-state conflict, with fractured rebel groups fighting one another, probably due to limited governance. And basic point, the structural drivers of intrastate conflict, political violence, such as a youthful population in combination with widespread exclusion, rapid urbanization, and deep-seated poverty and inequality, are the most intractable in sub-Saharan Africa. The democratic deficit and current momentum of violence in key countries such as Libya and Egypt point to continued instability in large regions of North Africa. And these stubborn drivers will retain their influence for future generations because social change takes time. This reinforces the importance of governance, over which policymakers and practitioners have much greater influence in the short to medium term. Now, it is important, therefore, I have made an argument, and the video also shows the structural drivers of instability. And that the one area that we have a degree of control over is governance, and we can model governance. We normally model the thickness of governance using 3 dimensions: security, capacity, and inclusion. These are the 3 dimensions, the 3 of governance. And we can model that, and we can forecast that, and we can compare regions and countries with one another. And if we, to illustrate this point, this is a very complicated way of saying things that in actual fact we all know. I think the difference is we can prove it. So, a bit of a summary on the governance stuff. The largest source of insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa is our governance deficit. In terms of security, capacity, and inclusion, the 3 dimensions of governance. African states, however, have to build governance in a globalized world, which is difficult. In a sense, government is the only thing that protects African states, weak states, from the impact of globalization, multinationals, to deal with inequality and so on. The largest source of instability in North Africa is its democratic deficit. Well, that holds for the whole Middle East. The fact that North Africa, by African comparative standards, have much higher levels of GDP per capita, much higher levels of education, but the economy and the politics is controlled by a very small elite. And that lack of inclusion is what drove the Arab Spring at one level of analysis. To an extent, as Africa rises, and Africa is rising, Africa is and will shortly be the region that grows the fastest. And of every top 10, 20, 30, 40 top growing economies, the majority will increasingly be in Africa. But that rise, development in itself, creates instability. We think that if we are peaceful, we will develop. But the reality is that instability and development go hand in hand. Just think of India. So, let's conclude. I've made a number of very basic points. I've said as population numbers increase, the number of instances of armed conflict. So we must remember that when we look at television, we think everything is burning and so on and so forth. But there are more people, so there must be more conflict. The question is, can the relative increase in instability be lower than our population increase? But measured as a proportion to population numbers, people are safer and more prosperous than during any previous century. If you look at this trend from a distance, I mean, trends go like this, but if we really look at the trend over time, we always tend to forget that we live in an unprecedented era of prosperity and stability. Now, it is true that bipolar competition between the West and the former Warsaw Pact disrupted this long-term downward trend for more than a generation. And the question is, the move towards greater multipolarity could do the same. Multipolarity is not more unstable than bipolarity. What is unstable is the move from one to the other. Change is inherently disruptive and unstable, and that's the challenge that we face. Forecast of sub-Saharan Africa's growth rates. We come from a lower base, but the prospects for Africa are good. Average growth rates in excess of 6% for all of 54 of Africa's countries. It's good, but it's not good enough. Africa needs to grow faster if it is able to reduce poverty and give jobs to its young people. So Africa, as the poorest and least developed continent, suffers a large conflict burden. The relationship between poverty and instability is a one-on-one relationship. If you want to know where the world is unstable, look where the world is poor. The future of terrorism in Africa is a potential wild card, and the short-term prognosis is unclear, but I don't think that Africa will emerge as the next big growth region in terrorism. Yet, the conflict burden in Africa will expectedly resume its downward trend, although international developments will impact. Remember, I've said that we've seen an increase since 2010 in instability. We're saying over time that probably will mediate and go down again. This will largely be a function of increase of government capacity, because government capacity is determined by growth and the quality of governance. From a very the majority of future fast-growing economies will be located in Africa, by all things being equal, although a number of countries, in our view about 10 African countries, will remain trapped in fragility. So countries like Somalia, the DRC, Sudan, both Sudans, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, these countries will remain fragile because this is a generational challenge. It's not something that's going to change overnight. They're very young populations, government control is weak, and so on. So we see a complex story of Africa rising, while some countries remain very fragile and unstable. With a growing consumer base, a large worker-age population, and low wage structure, the prospects are positive. After India, we are the next big market. But violence will remain a feature of Africa's future trajectory. Because remember, I created the linkage between development and violence, and that will have to be managed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think this has been a fascinating presentation. And let me just say that Africa is important to India. It has always been. In terms of the Indian population living in all of Africa, whether it's in Eastern Africa or in Southern Africa, there is a sizable number. And it's a sizable foreign population in all of this region. And therefore, Africa has been in Indian consciousness for many decades. And of course, one of the essential areas of engagement has also been not only Nehru's post-colonial engagement with Africa and its commitment to the free of colonization of Africa, and therefore support to the democratic process in all African countries, and of course a strong support to the movement in South Africa itself, but also subsequently and concurrently in peacekeeping operations. It is 55 years ago that India sent its peacekeeping operations to Congo, early 1961. And by far the largest United Nations peacekeeping operations has been by Indian soldiers. In all the countries of Africa where United Nations have been deployed, Indian soldiers, Indian forces have been involved in a very significant way and have made a very valuable contribution. Africa is a country with 1 billion people. And as Jakkie has mentioned, there's a 6% rate of growth. And this is likely to increase, accelerate. And this is a region of this century. And this whole of the continent, of course, can be divided into many parts. Northern Africa will have a different set of problems, different set of questions, and the rest of Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa, will have a totally different set of problems. But the potential that remains is absolutely enormous. And this is what one area where India has to now get engaged. The priority has to be accorded to Africa now. We are conscious of our relationship in the world as it's going forward, India's role in it, and the contribution it can make. It has to be in partnership with Africa. Thank you, Jakkie, for this excellent presentation. Awareness of Africa is not very high in Delhi or in India. We need to do much more and get much closer in many different ways. And this, I think, is at least one step in that direction. Thank you very much.